Hello, everyone. Welcome to Why Isn't Our Site on the First Page of Google? I'm Sean Williams, Vice President and Practice Lead for True Digital Communications. In a moment, we'll get our program started and turn things over to our presenter, Pam Long, Senior Digital Strategist of True Digital Communications. I've recently joined True Digital following some 8 years as owner of Communication Ammo, and I'm delighted to be part of the True team. A few housekeeping notes. Doing a webinar can seem like talking to one's self. So if you have questions for Pam, please drop them into the chat and we'll make sure we'll answer as many as we can. Also, we'll have a couple of quick polls for you during the webinar, so stay alert for that. In addition, this webinar is being recorded, so all of you will have a chance to go back and listen again to capture every morsel of delicious information we've got to give. Thank you for joining us. Now, on with the program. Because you've chosen to join us today, it's likely you've heard our question, why isn't our site on the first page of Google? Maybe from your boss or from a client or from a coworker. You've probably also asked yourself this question, what am I missing? To educate us all, I'm happy to introduce my esteemed colleague, Pam Long. Pam, the digital stage is yours.
Thank you, Sean. As Sean mentioned, I'm Pam Long. I'm Senior Digital Strategist at True Digital Communications. I figured it out ahead of this webinar. I started doing SEO in 1997, and Google did its first index in 1998. So I have actually been doing search longer than Google has. I started back in the glory days when InfoSeek and AltaVista were the top search engines. And I've had an opportunity over the last 20 years to really watch the whole evolution of search and how it's changed over time. We're going to spend the next hour talking about search engines, primarily Google, and what makes them tick. It's an incredibly complex topic. Search engines don't make things easy on marketers, but at the end of the day, we want to give you enough information to begin to understand why your site isn't on the first page of Google or isn't ranking the way you want it to, and what you can do, what plan you can make, the next steps that you need to take to begin to improve that performance. We're going to talk a lot about expectations as we go through today. There are a lot of challenges to improving a site's visibility, and understanding what those are can help you begin to figure out how you want to answer that why aren't we at the top page or why aren't we at the top rank yet. We're going to talk about search engine optimization. We'll also call that SEO throughout this, which is simply the process of improving visibility. And we're going to talk about ranking factors. What the search engines take into consideration when they determine how to display results. You'll see some specific examples from searches and businesses as we go through today, but keep in mind they really apply to any type of business. It doesn't matter if you're online only or brick and mortar, if you're a local business versus a national business, if you're B2B or B2C. Most of the factors that we're going to talk about today are going to be important regardless of your business structure. Search should be a part of your marketing and communication strategy. Unfortunately, it's a tactic that's very much at the mercy of the search engines themselves. They regularly make changes. They change their minds. They don't share their algorithm. It's proprietary. It's kind of like Coke and its secret recipe. So there's no one-size-fits-all guaranteed formula for getting to the top of the search engines. So what we want to do is help you set that expectation, what it will take to get where you want to be, and prioritize those next steps. When we talk about search today, we're going to talk primarily about Google, and there's a couple reasons for that. Google is the 800-pound gorilla. Depending on whose statistics you believe, it's up to 80% of all desktop searches and 95% of all mobile searches take place on Google. To put that into perspective a little bit for you, YouTube, which conveniently enough is owned by Google, is considered to be the second largest search engine in the world. Bing comes in a distant third to that. Pinterest handles more searches on its own site than Yahoo does, and it also plays a big role in Google search results, and we'll show you some information about that as we go on. And then there's poor Yahoo that kind of comes in at number 5. The other reason we're going to concentrate on Google is because for the most part, if you make Google happy, you'll make Bing and Yahoo happy as well. There are some differences in their algorithm, but the main factors overlap enough that if you optimize for Google, you'll be fine anywhere else, at least in the US. International search can be a little different. We're going to throw around some terms today that you may not have heard. So if we say something that you're not familiar with, if you want a definition or need us to back up, just raise your hand in the chat and throw up a question. We'll try to answer as many as we can as we go along. But starting with search engine optimization, the simplest definition is it's just the process of maximizing the number of visitors to a particular website by ensuring that the site appears high on the list of results returned by a search engine. So it's relatively straightforward, at least in terms of a definition. Why is this so important? More than 90% of all adult internet users use search engines. And depending on the industry they're in or the type of problem they're trying to solve, their patterns can be fairly different. In some industries, you'll see a lot of searches. They search early and often. They use it for education. They use it to answer questions. They use it to seek solutions. That education piece may come into play when there isn't really a need that's ever going to convert to looking for a business, but it is their primary resource. For other industries, you tend to see search happening later on in the process. They've already identified some options. They're supplementing what they know about a brand or a solution from offline research, or they're validating their choice before they hand information off to someone else. The other thing that's important to keep in mind, especially for B2B, is that the person who is researching and doing all of the information gathering online may not be the person who's making the final decision. So you'll see some variations in how users search depending on whether they are a CEO who's going to sign off on a very large purchase, or the person who's gathering information to hand off to that CEO, or a person who's gathering information for themselves. The important part of all this is that you can't be part of the consideration set if you can't be found. So search is very important. Defining search engine optimization is relatively simple, but the process of actually improving your rankings is not. Back in the old days, when I started on search engine optimization, the only way to control your rankings on a search engine was to stuff keywords in your content. And they didn't necessarily have to make sense to a user. They just had to show up in the right proportion of keywords to content. And it was fairly easy to influence and control your rankings as a result of that. And that's still to some extent what most people think about when we talk about search engine optimization. They kind of stop at that keywords and content phase. But it's actually much more complicated than that. So this is your first chance to chime in. A quick question for all of you. You're going to see a poll pop up over on the chat side of your screen. How many different search ranking factors are in Google's search algorithm today? So go ahead and just answer that. We'll see the results as we go along, and we'll circle back here at the end in a minute and see how accurate you were. So while you're doing that, back in about 2006, Google announced that they used 200 individual ranking factors to determine how they display search results. And then Bing kind of jumped all over that and said, well, we have superior search results because we use 1,000 ranking factors. And then Google came back after that comment and said, well, all of our 200 ranking factors actually have 50 different variables, so it's 10,000 ranking factors. And it's just been kind of a big game of my search algorithm is bigger than your search algorithm ever since then. Okay. So the other thing that gets tricky about that, so we had several people who said 2,000, so you were close. And it depends. Everybody defines it differently. No one will say exactly how many. They all argue about who has the biggest. But the other thing that's challenging on top of that there are so many moving parts to search, is that they do in fact move. Google makes changes to their algorithms 500 to 600 times a year. And most of the time they're minor adjustments. Some of them are major, but basically they're changing their logic about once every 16 hours. So even if you do everything right from an optimization standpoint, even if your site is ranking #1 today, chances are that's going to change because the search engines change their logic. So when we go back to those online factors, the on-site factors, what you say and how you say it, keywords within content, that's an area where you start to see the size of the team that could potentially be involved in search engine optimization. On-site is usually the easiest to define. It's your webmaster. It may be a team of content developers. You may have blog contributors, and generally lies within kind of your marketing and communications function. Search engines started figuring out fairly early on that webmasters were gaming the system, that it was easy for them to control because it was keywords and content. And they would put keywords in places keywords should never go, just to get a good ranking but it didn't necessarily create a good user experience. They were writing much more for the search engines than they were for people. So search engines started looking for other cues as to how authoritative and trustworthy your website was. And one of the first things they looked at were links from other sites back to yours. What they were looking for were long-term logical relationships that occurred naturally between multiple websites. This is where you start to get into content that exists somewhere other than your own site. So content that exists on another site or what another site thinks of yours, driving links and improving visibility. So at this point, you've kind of moved beyond just your basic webmaster, and you may be looking at involving your media relations team, your community relations team, people who are in charge of those external relationships. Once they had the offsite factors down, Google started looking at how can it personalize results? How can it return even more relevant information? And personalized search results just simply means that Google takes either your past behavior online, your browsing habits, or collective behavior of all of its users to return different sets of results for the exact same search when they're conducted by two different people. And you see this every day and probably don't even think about it. Local results are probably the most relevant and the most common example of what personalization can look like. So when we talk about local, there's 3 different ways that you can get localized results. So the results that show a map, that show locations, that actually let you navigate to a physical place. So the first way is that you ask for local results. You Googled for something and you included a city name or a zip code or some other designation that told Google exactly what geographic area that you want to look at. The second way is that you told Google you want results near me, and Google is able to determine where you, or at the very least where your computer or your smartphone is currently located, and it combines that with cues from the website itself and returns local results. The third way is where Google gets a little sneaky because it's not only personalization, it's context. So Google, you conduct a search, you don't put any local indicator in there, but Google, based on history and from all of its other users, will assume that's what you really want because that's the pattern it's seen in the past. So restaurants and retail locations are a great example of this. If you search on your phone for McDonald's or for Staples or Home Depot or whatever it might be, Google automatically shows you a local result, whether you ask for local or not. And it's based a lot on how mobile searchers have changed the landscape. Desktop searchers tend to use a keyword query, a couple of words, where mobile searchers who are using Siri or Alexa or something similar will ask a whole question. And those questions give Google a lot of context about what those shorter searches actually mean. So beyond restaurants and retail, we see this a lot when we do work with private schools. This is a perfect example. If you search for private schools with no geographic designation, Google knows based on history that there's a limited geographic footprint. There's a limited distance you're willing to drive to consider a private school. So it will show you local results. In my case, if I search from my home office, there is a traditional big brick building private school about 5 miles from me. And that's what I would expect to see. Google, knowing how other searchers behave, actually shows me much more local results than that. So they may not fit exactly the image I had in mind, but they are small community, truly private, but for the most part, church-based schools in my area. And they're so targeted that the very first one on that list, I can hear the kids on the playground. It's about a block and a half from my house. So at that point, you're not talking about local in terms of miles, you're talking about local in terms of blocks. And Google can get that specific with search results. If you flip that a little bit and you search for a boarding school, Google knows that there is really no geographic limit just by the nature of boarding schools. Past behavior has told it people will consider the best school regardless of distance. So you'll see an entirely different set of search results that's national rather than locally based. So you have 2 very similar searches. Neither one of them include a geographic designator, 2 entirely different sets of search results based on what Google knows about searcher behavior. So if you have a brick and mortar location where geography and proximity are important to your audience, there are some specific things you can do to tell Google where you're located and then begin to tie that together with searcher behavior so that your site shows up in relevant search results for something that's location-based. We're going to talk about this a bit more as we go on, but reviews and ratings are one of the things that feed very much into those local search results. And again, you may be looking at your marketing and communications team to talk to previous clients and begin to gather some information, some reviews and ratings that way. It may be administrative assistant who's sending out a survey or monitoring a couple of key websites. But all of that starts to feed into local factors along with some other things that we'll get into in a bit more detail in a few minutes. The last set of factors, so if you take that whole 200 or 10,000 or whatever it is, we kind of group it into these four groups. The last set of factors is technical, and it comes down to how user and device friendly your website is. 2016 was the first year that mobile searches outranked desktop searches. More searches took place on mobile devices. And Google knows that there's different expectations for users when they search using a mobile device. They expect things to be quick, they expect them to navigate a bit differently, and they're beginning to put more weight on those factors that tell them a website is mobile friendly, not just search friendly. So if you're part of a corporation, part of an agency where you have a large team of people, you can see how you can begin to draw in multiple people around this single kind of search optimization goal. But if you're part of a small company, you may have a small team. It may be just one or two people. And if you are that team of one, here's an expectation that you need to keep in mind. You can do it all, but you can't do it all at once. So you really need to determine where you're going to start and prioritize your activities. When we look at that whole list of factors, kind of group them together, offsite and local go together. Offsite and local account for about 60% of the ranking factors that Google looks at. This is a little fuzzy since every search engine has their own secret sauce and won't give you the numbers. This is kind of a best guess estimate, but in any case, we know offsite factors weigh far more than onsite. Having said that, onsite is often the easiest to assess, the easiest to determine where you are today and move forward and fix. So in a lot of cases, it's where we recommend clients start. So when we talk about on-site factors, there's the traditional. There's keywords and content, which everyone thinks of. There's keywords in page headlines and subheadlines. And then there are also keywords in anchor text. So how you word links between pages of your site. This is actually a really good example. If you look at that little circled link at the very bottom of the page, this is a good example of what not to do. Because here, as a link doesn't tell Google anything about the page you're linking to. It's much more effective if you can include keywords in those links to give Google a cue as to what that page is about. So in this case, if they had made early childhood the actual link text instead of here, that would have been more effective. All of these are content cues that are visible to a user on the page itself. There are some other on-site optimization opportunities that aren't necessarily as immediately obvious. The number one most important for Google is title tag. Title tag is actually part of your site code. It shows up in a browser tab if you don't have 25 tabs open like I usually do, in a browser bar, and it's also the clickable link in a search result. The other areas that you can optimize are URLs and file names, image file names, and image alt tags. An alt tag is just a little piece of code that kind of wraps around an image as part of your site's HTML, and it allows you to put a description there. You'll notice on some websites, if you mouse over an image, you'll see a little description pop up. That's controlled by an alt tag. For a long time, alt tags were used primarily for people who were using assistive software to help them read a screen. And Google figured out fairly early on that if there was descriptive information in an image, it was also a good source for keywords. And that's why they take it into consideration. But when you look at this, when you look at all the potential locations for keywords on a page, you can really see search engine optimization is not so much about optimizing a site as it is optimizing each page individually for a limited set of keywords. When we talk about image names, if you use descriptive file names instead of the odd numeric name that your camera may have assigned to an image, and you use alt tags, Google can look at that information and it can begin to evaluate and display your images independent of the rest of your content. So if you're in an industry where visuals play an important part in a customer decision, this can be a great way to increase visibility and to own more of those first page results. So think in terms of product photos or inspirational photos, which are very big for our clients who are in the building products industry. Infographics, anything that has potential to catch a searcher's eye, to provide valuable information by itself, should be optimized, and it provides another entry point back to your website. So what else is important from an on-site standpoint? Google gives priority to sites that are well maintained and frequently updated. And what it's looking for in that case is new content, not just changes to existing pages. It wants to see new information added to your site on a regular basis. This can get to be a little challenging. It doesn't necessarily have to be what you think of as traditional static site content, because sites can get huge if that's a part of your strategy. This is where blogging really comes into play. Blogging is an excellent opportunity to respond to things that may be a bit more timely. So whether they're trends within your industry, things that you're seeing happen on a B2C, on a consumer side, new awareness for specific topics, they can be a great way to respond quickly, to capitalize on topics that have a lot of search interest at that point in time, but that you don't necessarily want to address as part of your static site content. The last factor we want to talk about in terms of on-site is meta description. Meta descriptions, and you can think of them almost like a mini ad for each page of your website. They give users a compelling reason to click through to your site from search results. And the example that's up on the screen, the big blue text at the top, those are title tags that now create a clickable link, and the gray text underneath it is controlled by meta descriptions. Meta descriptions are usually the last thing you add. They generally go in after all the other site content. This is where SEO fatigue starts to kick in, and we see a lot of clients who either skip this step, or they use one meta description for an entire group of pages, or they let their content management system generate one from the content on the page. It's really worth the time to write these specifically for each page, to customize them, to treat them like ad copy. They don't necessarily make a difference in how your site ranks, but they make a huge difference in click-through rate. The other reason you want to spend some time on them is because if you don't create a meta description, Google will make one up from the content it can find on the page. And you can see from the example at the bottom, it very seldom ends well for anyone. They will very rarely pick up anything that makes sense. It tends to be a lot of the navigation things that come in out of context. And in this particular case, it's picked up an entire string of email addresses, which just opens you up to all kinds of other problems. So spend some time on meta descriptions. Don't let Google drive that part. But back to our list of ranking factors. We talked a lot about on-site. We move to off-site. Off-site factors tell Google whether your site is well-respected and authoritative. This can be a challenge because, as the name implies, these are all things that happen outside of your normal site content. They are harder to control, they take more effort, but they play a big part in search rankings. And the number one off-site factor is inbound links. So that's what other sites say about your site, how they link to you, how those relationships are formed, what happens over time. When Google first started looking at links as an indicator of quality, it focused purely on quantity, how many sites linked to yours. The problem with that, much like keywords and content, is it was too easy for people to manipulate the system, to buy links or to generate huge quantities of links from websites that didn't really add any value. So they've switched, and they look very much at quality. So they are looking for a logical reason for a site to connect to yours, whether that's that you share common audiences, you're part of the same industry, you have similar types of content. There needs to be a reason. So think of it not so much as sites linking to each other, but sites building relationships with each other. And those relationships, just like offline relationships, should grow organically over time. How sites link to you is also very important. So if you look at the couple of underlined links in this example, you'll see that they all contain a school name. So back to our on-site example where click here is a poor idea for link content. You want people to link to you in a way that tells Google what your site is about. Linking to you by name, the way that you see here, is probably the most common. But if there are opportunities to work with that linking site, to ask them to link to you with some keywords in that name, or to link to something deeper than your homepage, that carries more value in Google's eyes. So in the case of our company, we tend to talk about ourselves a lot of times as just true. But that's not ever how we would want another site to link to ours, because that word doesn't mean anything by itself. At a minimum, we would want it to be the full name, True Digital Communications. In the best case, we would want them to say True Digital Communications, experts in search engine optimization, or whatever the particular topic is. So link building, because so much of it happens offline, and because you do have to reach out to other sites to begin to build that network, it takes a lot of time. Again, think of it not in terms of just static content, but opportunities to build new content. The best way to encourage links to your content is to create content visitors want to share. Back to our previous example about blogs on your website and being timely and relevant and answering those frequently asked questions. Can also look for opportunities to contribute off of your site. So industry blogs or other publications where you can share information, share content on social media, ask for links from completely offline activities. Like if you speak at a particular event, make sure your speaker bio includes a link back to your website. There's been some debate. We talked a little bit about social sharing, about how much of a role social sharing plays in search rankings. And it's still kind of a maybe. None of the search engines will come out and say that they take social signals into consideration, but there have been some experiments that show sites that have more social shares do rank better. It's particularly if those shares come from Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, and Google. And that's an important designation. These are the social channels that are currently most important to the search engines, but they may not be the channels that are currently most important to your users. So Instagram is a great example. It's a very visual medium. It's a great social channel from some of our clients. But at this point in time, it doesn't play into rankings. So you really have to balance what's most important to the search engines versus what's most important to your actual users. And there may be cases where you choose a platform for one reason or the other. Google Plus as a social platform doesn't offer a lot for most of our customers beyond search ranking influence. Instagram is a different story. So if you're considering adding a social channel to your marketing mix and you're struggling a bit with search rankings, it makes sense to be aware of what ones might potentially be able to do double duty for you. So we mentioned Pinterest. We talked about Pinterest a little bit earlier as the third largest search engine. And this is why it's important. Pinterest has done a phenomenal job of building their own search engine and teaching their users how to write keyword-rich descriptions so that they can be found within Pinterest. They have also done a phenomenal job of making their data available to be indexed by Google. And because they already have keyword-rich descriptions, if you're searching for something that has a heavy visual component to it, Pinterest can really dominate search results to the point of driving out individual websites. So if Pinterest is part of your marketing mix, or you are struggling and visual content is something that you have a lot of and can share, it is definitely worth spending the time. We talk about local results. So back to that private school, restaurant, retail example. All the factors we've talked about previously are still important, along with a couple of new ones. So in addition to keywords and content, you need content that connects you to your community. So you can think in terms of blog posts on your site that perhaps talk about your business's involvement in a local event, or a page on your About section that talks about the community that you are a part of. For schools, especially when we work with them, if new families coming into an area are a major source of students for them, then being able to talk about that area and give people a good feeling about the city they may be moving to is a great way to accomplish that. The other thing that you need to have is a clear address and phone number that Google can read. So that's part of your site content, part of your site code, not part of an image. And if you have multiple locations, you really need to have a content strategy to localize content for every single one of them. Similarly, all the offsite factors that we talked about previously are important for local search, and then we're going to add a few more. So local links and linking domains. Plus, the number one thing that you can do for local search results is having a complete Google My Business page. They're going to give you a chance to answer again. How would you rate your current Google My Business page? And it's okay if your answer is my what? because we do get that periodically. So go ahead and hop over to the chat section, answer a quick question, and we'll kind of come back at the end and see where you all are and if there are additional questions that come out of that. So Google My Business basically is just, it's a profile set up on Google itself. It's independent of your website that can show up as a separate entity in search results. So the more complete your profile is, the more beneficial it is for two reasons. Number one, because it does influence your local ranking. And number two, because it is a standalone. So as you can see in this example, you can get a lot of information about a website or a business from that profile without ever clicking through to the website. But you can also get directly to what's most important. You can get directly to directions. You can get to the website. You can get to a phone number. So looking at our poll, we're kind of all over the place. We do have a few people who aren't sure, some people who have it set up and regularly updated, and then a couple in the middle. So that's not too bad. And so the other question we'll get a lot is, we have one or someone started one, but we don't know who has the keys to it. And that could be a little bit frustrating. So when you're setting up that Google profile, you want to make sure you take advantage of every field you can possibly fill out. You want to have a compelling description. You want to make sure that your street address, your telephone number, and if it's applicable, your hours of operation are included in there. You want to include a logo if people are familiar with you enough that the logo will be a trigger that they're on the right website or they're clicking through to the right results. That can be very helpful. You also want to include photos. You want a positive, compelling, inviting kind of atmosphere created through those photos. And you want to spend some time looking at the categories that Google has available to make sure that you're choosing the best descriptor for your business. So if we go back to that earlier search result for boarding schools, this is another way that Google My Business results are important. All that information that you see at the top, the carousel of logos, more important for a physical user. So if you're a restaurant, it's Urban Spoon. It might be City Search or something similar. So again,
Pam?
kind of back, yes.
Pam, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're getting a message from a couple of users that the live stream is offline.
Okay.
Our moderator should be keeping track of that. So we just need to verify.
Back up. All right, seeing lots of confirmation that it's moving again.
Okay, that was a little scary. Sorry about that, folks.
That's okay.
I think, Pam, if you go back to the beginning of local factors here on the slide, I think we'll be fine. And folks on the phone, does that work? We just start at this at the top of this again.
Okay, we can do that. Right. So the example that you see on the screen is a local search result with the little stars, little rankings, and it's typically out of 5. How many stars out of 5? That's controlled by reviews, primarily through reviews on your Google My Business page. If you have 7 or more, you'll see those stars and those reviews show up in your local site, in your local results. You'll also see Facebook reviews play into that. They also influence Google ranking. And Yelp results influence Apple Maps, which is the default for people who are using an iPhone or an iPad. And this is where it gets to be important to distinguish between what's important for SEO, so Google My Business, Facebook, and Yelp, versus what might be more relevant for your audience. So examples are for restaurants, it might be Urban Spoon, it might be something like City Search. We'll see for lawyers and doctors and dentists, they have their own kind of review aggregators that are often run by insurance companies. So again, evaluating what's important for search versus what may help you from a business perspective in other places. And then the last local offsite factor that we want to talk about are regional and industry directories. This gets to be a little complicated. There are about 55 different directories, so think your traditional yellow pages, but now online, that play into local search results. And they vary by city as to which one is highest priority, which ones you need to concentrate on. And this is where Moz.com is a phenomenal resource. So we shared the link. You can do some research. It outlines the top directories for a number of cities. And it also goes one step further, and it outlines the directories by category. So depending on the type of business you're in, there are some very specific directories that not only influence search results, but by themselves have a really strong presence and it's worth it for you to investigate those. Make sure you have a current and complete listing. So going back again to our private school example, we see this a lot in our work with private schools. There are a number of directories and review sites for private schools that dominate search results. And it can be very frustrating if you're trying to optimize for a specific client website, or if you're someone like Colorado Academy, who's that little link right there in the middle, kind of surrounded by this sea of directories, to unseat those directories. They're very well established. And our recommendation in that case is don't unseat them, join them. Look at which ones are most prominent in your area and make sure you have a current, complete, compelling listing. They've already done the hard work to get to the first page of the results. Piggyback on that and take advantage. When you're putting together your directory listings, the number one thing you have to keep in mind is that consistency is king. A lot of those smaller directories, that list of 55 that we listed, automatically pull results from a handful of much larger directories. And it's all an automated process. There's no body reviewing it. So that logic behind the system that creates those new small directory listings gets thrown off when it sees inconsistencies. So the difference between abbreviations and punctuation, even simple things as down to how your phone numbers are formatted, can create multiple listings, which may not seem like a bad thing until you start trying to manage them and keep them up to date. So you'll have a listing that the directory has created that has some incorrect information, but you may be working off the listing that you created. So it's worth it to try to avoid that problem as much as possible. So making sure you look at things like, do you abbreviate street designations or do you spell them out? If you have a PO box, do you use that in combination with the street? Do you use street by itself? Do you use PO box by itself? Any of those are fine as long as they're all done the same way. In the case of PO box, do you have periods in that abbreviation or not? Are you using a zip code or a zip +4 or a postal code? And how do you want to use that throughout all of your directory listings? And finally, the one that throws people off a lot is phone number. So whether you use dashes, whether you use dots, whether you use parentheses around an area code, whether you have a separate format for an international phone number. So deciding early on exactly how you want to treat that and making sure that everyone who's responsible for directory listings knows what that standard is will save you a lot of trouble in the long run. For most of our clients, when we start looking at local SEO performance, this is one of the biggest challenges that we see. Now, this is where there's probably a long history of listings that were not well managed that you need to go back and clean up. So the last set of factors we talked about early on were technical. And this all comes down to the increase in mobile users. So it's how responsive is your design? Is it mobile friendly? Is your page easy to navigate? Does it load quickly? And Google is very much concerned at this point about user experience. They know if a site is difficult to navigate or a page loads slowly, the user is likely to leave. They don't have a lot of patience for that. And they're starting to move toward treating mobile sites differently than desktop. Right now, everything in the Google search results is driven by the mobile version of your website. That's what determines your ranking. Is driven by the desktop version of your website. So even if your mobile site looks dramatically different and has different content, desktop is what's driving. Google is moving away from that, and the first step toward that is developing a mobile-only index. So they'll have one index purely for desktop versions of desktop sites, and that's what you'll see when you search on a desktop, and they'll have one version of mobile results for when you search on a mobile device. This is where, when we looked at that team of people who might be involved in SEO, this is where you really may need to depend on an outside resource if you're using a third party to manage your website, or on your IT or technical team to help you evaluate whether or not you're meeting the current standards for mobile readiness and what changes you might need to make. It's certainly something you need to consider if you're in the process of redesigning your website or evaluating a new content management system. So we have thrown a lot of information at you in the last 40 or so minutes. I'm going to take a few minutes and just recap some of the high points. If you have questions, now is the time to chime in. We would love to come back at the end and answer any that you may have. It can be a little bit overwhelming, so please feel free to use that chat and let us know that you're still there and you're still listening. Okay. So starting off, Search engine optimization has a lot of moving parts, and the factors that have the biggest influence aren't even part of your website. So it is not a simple one-time fix. It is something that's going to take an actual strategy and a plan and some continual implementation. On-site SEO should be ongoing. Every time you add new content to your site or update site pages, you need to make sure that it's still well optimized for search. If you're a small team or a single person team, again, you're going to be able to do it all eventually, but you are certainly not going to be able to do it all at once. You have to prioritize. On-site will probably be the easiest place for you to start, but link building, which is the more important, is going to take the most time. So plan accordingly. While we're talking about link building, you need to treat it as something that's organic and that does happen over a long period of time. So regularly producing new content that people will want to share is the best way to influence rankings. Contributing content to sites outside of yours, building relationships with sites that will share your content, and making sure that everything that you produce has a purpose, that it adds value, and that it is easy to share. So there is a question about finding keywords and what are the best keyword research tools and what are free. Ironically enough, we're going to show at the end of this on May 31st, we are going to do another webinar that will focus on just that topic. So we realize that's a big topic. It's more than we could fit in this and talk about in any kind of detail, but we are definitely going to talk about it in the future. Quick question, SEMrush is a tool that we use often. There is a free version that gives you limited results, but can be a great place to start. In terms of tools, it's one of the ones that we recommend most. Yeah. So we talked about the idea of link building as long-term relationship. It's also an opportunity when you are looking at that content and reaching out to other websites to start to share the burden a bit. This is probably where you're going to have to bring in some other members of your team or some other members of your company, whether they're contributing to a regular column on your blog or identifying sites that they have a relationship where they can reach out personally to begin to build some of those online connections. Excuse me. We talk about directory listings. Again, something that you need to review regularly because those smaller engines do generate listings automatically. They will sneak in there when you don't know that they exist yet. So taking time at least once a year to go through and look at the listings that you already have control over to make sure that they're still current, that information doesn't need to change. And then Googling your company as well to see what new listings may have been generated by the directories themselves, and making sure that those are consistent. Depending on your business, you also want to take the time to Google kind of your high visibility employees. Did a project recently for a law firm, for example, and they had a new partner who had been an independent contractor for a number of years and had also worked at 3 previous law offices. If you Googled him by name, which was how people were more likely to look for him, they found all of that outdated contact and directory information, and all of that needed to be cleaned up before that new partner started to bring value to the current firm in terms of search visibility. So this is a great project for a summer intern, or if you traditionally have a slowdown at the end of the year and you're looking for housekeeping kind of things to do, definitely put this on your list. And the last one that we really haven't talked about much through all of this, Google is very fast to make changes on their own and very slow to reflect changes you make, which can be very frustrating. Depending on the size of your site, how often you're updating, how often you're producing new content, it can take 2 to 3 months for you to really begin to see relevant results. In some cases, it'll happen quicker, but if you set the expectation that it will take time, that's definitely going to help. So making your plan in terms of your strategy for search engine optimization, working that plan for a while, and then being patient. And really planning for the first few months at least that you may be reporting more on your efforts than on actual results. Okay. So it's your turn. Any questions that you didn't have a chance to answer, anything you'd like to go back and talk about in a bit more detail, now is your opportunity to hop on the chat and let us know what you're thinking.
Thanks, Pam. And once again, if you have a question, you can just drop it right into the chat and we'll try to answer it once we see it. We'll just see if there are no more questions. Obviously, a brilliant presentation, Pam. There are no questions at this time.
I will actually backtrack just a little bit. When we were going through this as a group, okay, so here's one. This one has come up before. If a site links to you and uses click here for your link on your website, thank you, Allison, is it okay to ask them to fix it? Yes, absolutely. And that's where like having that team that might have relationships with that other website or that other content provider, it's absolutely okay to send them an email or pick up the phone and say, hey, you're linking to our website. Would you mind including this as the link text and telling them specifically what you want them to say? Especially if it's a case where your business name might have an acronym or have a shorter version, being consistent in how you ask people to link to you can have a big impact on your rankings. Okay. One that also comes up when we talk to clients. So there's always that one client who develops a new website and 3 weeks later, somebody gets an email from some random company that says, I can guarantee you a #1 spot on Google. Run away. Please run away. There is no guaranteed way to get there. And if they are willing to say we can't get you there, chances are they can't keep you there because they're using tactics like buying links that are eventually, they may work in the short term, they are eventually going to cause Google to penalize you. And it is a whole lot more work to get out of trouble with Google than it is to do it right the first time. Okay. A question from Kate. Are there word counts that are appropriate for meta titles or meta descriptions? Yes, there are. I don't have them in my notes, but I believe it's about 60 to 70 characters for title and about 25 to 35 words for meta descriptions. I would encourage you before you start writing to Google exactly that because Google does change their count every once in a while. And they are currently actually looking at and testing very long meta descriptions. So if you've written all your meta descriptions by all of the old rules and they introduce and allow these much longer meta descriptions, you will definitely want to revisit your site at that point because just from a visual standpoint, the new descriptions are so much longer that they look blockier on a page. They catch attention much better. So if Google makes regular updates to things like that, you definitely want to try to keep up on that and adjust your site accordingly. They don't very often make changes that are going to be big enough that you really have to revisit. That will probably be one of them. The only other one that really comes to mind in recent years was Mobilegeddon, the whole idea that if your site isn't mobile friendly, it will be excluded from mobile search results. And that definitely has an impact. Question about regular content. Allison again. Allison is collecting questions from a couple of people, so she's not the only person raising her hand. How often do you suggest updating content? Weekly, bi-weekly? I'd say if you have a blog and can update that often with new content, that's great. I would say at a minimum, you want to aim for monthly. Question from Jessica. Google takes 3 months to update SEO. It depends on your website and the industry that you're in and how active you've been up to that point. Google visits your website on a schedule. And if it doesn't see new content for several weeks in a row, then it will slow down how often it visits. So when you do make major changes to your content, one of the things you can do is go through Search Console, used to be called Google Webmaster Tools, and let Google know you've made an update. That can help speed up that process. Otherwise, it can. We've seen clients where they'll start to see results in a few days or a few weeks. We've seen others, especially where they're doing link building, and it takes more time for Google to find those relationships, that it will be months before you'll see a significant change.
We still have a few more minutes. If you have any questions, you go ahead and drop them in the chat. But what we'll mention at this point is that today we talked about content and keywords among some other things. We're going to explore going into more detail on keywords to help drive visitors to your site throughout the decision-making process in our next webinar on the 31st of May. So look out for that. And it looks like we no longer have any questions. If there are no further questions, then we can finish a little bit early. Thanks very much for joining us today. From True Digital Communications, I'm Sean Williams for Pam Long. We'll be sending out an email with a link with a replay of today's webinar. And in the meantime, you can visit our site, truedigitalcom.com, and take a look at our case studies and reach out if there's anything we can do to help. We appreciate your time and your effort and your participation. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.